Episode 16.2, Talaat Pasha, the Architect of Exile. The Officers of Shadow, Chapter 2, The Fall of Empire. Prologue, The Voice of Shadows. Welcome to the Officers of Shadow. Here, history speaks, not from books, but from the graves. Every empire faces a day when swords grow dull, and the fate of nations is no longer written in battle, but in silence, with ink behind closed doors. In our previous episode, we followed Enver Pasha, the dreamer who marched into the snow with his army and never returned. But in his shadow rose another man, silent, methodical, calculating, a man who didn't dream, but decided. His name was Talaat Pasha, a minister whose power came not from the sword, but from the stillness of his hand. If you haven't joined this journey yet, now is the time, because from here on, history is written in blood. Scene 1. The Minister Behind the Curtain. Istanbul, Ottoman Ministry of the Interior, Spring 1915. In the marble corridors of the Ministry of the Interior, the sound of carriages echoes outside. People in the bazaars speak of war. Inside, one man makes a decision that will echo for centuries. Talaat Pasha, 40 years old, the son of a postal worker from Edirne, had risen to power through sheer will, intelligence, and cold precision. He was no soldier, no dreamer. He spoke softly, calculated constantly, and when he stared at the map of Anatolia, he saw not people, but patterns. In 1915, as the Ottoman front began to crumble, Talaat convinced himself that the real danger came from within, from those whom he believed were ready to betray the empire. Talaat, voice reconstruction. We are at war. The empire is burning. If we are to survive, we must cleanse the heart before it rots. A few days later, the orders were signed. Deportation, confiscation, silence. No drums of war were heard. No battles were fought. Only the echo of footsteps, long columns of people marching south. The war within had begun. Scene 2. The Silence of the Desert. Syrian Desert, Deir ez-Zor, summer 1916. The sun blazed mercilessly. Across the endless dunes, lines of people moved. Men, women, children, the elderly, starving, barefoot, fading into the sand. Their road led south, to the desert, to nowhere. Talaat Pasha never saw these marches. He remained in Istanbul, behind his desk, surrounded by reports, statistics, and sealed documents. To him, this was not murder. It was administration, not against people, but against a threat. Here, in the desert, history fell silent. The sun watched, but said nothing. Only the shadows remained, whispering names that would never return. Scene 3. The Fall of the Empire. Location, Istanbul, 1918. 3 years later, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. Foreign ships anchored in the Bosphorus. The city trembled beneath defeat. At night, Talaat fled with Enver and Jamal, the 3 pashas of the Committee of Union and Progress. In exile, he lived quietly in Berlin. No office, no power, no protection. From Talaat's letter, adapted. I never wished to harm anyone, but history does not weigh intention. It measures consequence. He spent his days in cafes, reading newspapers, watching the empire's ashes scatter across headlines. His name had become a curse. Scene 4. A bullet in Berlin. Berlin, Hardenbergstrasse, March 15, 1921. morning. The streets of Charlottenburg were quiet. Talaat left his apartment as he did every day. His steps were slow, measured, almost peaceful. Across the street, a young man waited, Ottoman Empire, an Armenian survivor of the deportations. In his pocket, a photograph of his mother. In his hand, a pistol. One shot, one heartbeat. And the man who had signed the orders of exile met his own exile in the middle of Berlin. Crowds gathered. The news spread quickly. Talaat Pasha, former minister of the interior of the Ottoman Empire, was dead. The trial that followed shocked the world. Talleyrand was acquitted, but the trial of history never ended. Scene 5, The Legacy of Shadows. Berlin, Istanbul, present day. For more than 2 decades, Talaat's body remained buried in Berlin. Then, in 1943, under Nazi Germany, his remains were returned to Turkey with full honors. Flags were raised, speeches made, and the man who once exiled millions was welcomed home as a statesman. Today, his name no longer appears on street signs, but in history, it cannot be erased. Talaat, Enver, and Jamal. 3 men, 3 dreams, 3 deaths. One wielded the sword, one the pen, one the sea. They were the last guardians of a dying empire and the first shadows of a new century. Talaat Pasha embodied the coldest face of power, the logic that kills emotion, the conviction that duty is greater than mercy. He proved that sometimes a signature can be deadlier than a war. Epilogue, the call of the next shadow. And so ends the 2nd chapter of The Officers of Shadow, the story of a man who wrote history with ink and ended it with a bullet. But the story isn't over. In the next episode, we sail into the Mediterranean to meet Cemal Pasha, the admiral who drowned the final heartbeat of an empire in the red waters of war. If you haven't yet, subscribe now, because here in The Officers of Shadow, we don't just tell history, we summon it in darkness between myth and truth.